Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Congressional App Challenge Debugged Podcast. I'm your host, Medha, and today our guest is Jason Toff, who's the founder and CEO of Things, a venture-backed startup making rooms. Jason's work experience includes product leadership positions at Google, Vine, and Meta. He resides in his hometown, Allentown, Pennsylvania, with his wife, Chrissy, and 3 children. So, Jason, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing awesome. It's raining outside in New York, so that sucks. But besides that, doing great. And so I just want to jump right into it. Can you tell us more about what is Things? Why is it called Things? What is it? What's the purpose? What's rooms? What's going on with all of that?
Sure. Things Inc. is a company I started about 2.5 years ago. And the genesis of the company was a realization that 3D interfaces are in some ways inevitable in our future, in the same way that when the television came out and there was black and white TV, it was inevitable that it was going to become color. It was inevitable that it was going to become higher resolution. It feels as if a similar thing will happen in our lifetime, where our digital interfaces that are almost entirely two-dimensional will become increasingly three-dimensional. And with that context in mind, the company started because in that world, it's important that anyone be able to create in 3D. And right now,
Right.
it's really, really hard to create in 3D. So the crux of our company is, how do we make it easier for people to create 3D content for our inevitable 3D future?
That's so interesting, especially with the Apple Vision Pro just coming out, right? I feel like everyone's talking about the AR and VR space and therefore the XYZ planes. What's your reaction to that? Like, is it exciting to see everyone, the general public is kind of caught up to something that you had a vision for 2 years ago, or what are you
It's
thinking about that?
interesting. I have mixed feelings, to be honest.
Hmm.
While I was at Google, I worked in their then like virtual reality department, which was
Right.
later disbanded and may or may not have been recreated. I don't know. Um, so I went through the hype cycle like 7 years ago of getting
Right.
so excited about AR VR, using it every day, and then seeing that like most people did not use it every day.
Yeah.
Our team purchased the Apple Vision Pros, and as a longtime fan of Apple, I've always thought in my head, like, once Apple does it, then it will be real.
Hmm.
Um, on the one hand, they've solved some crazy problems that no one else has solved before in a way that only
Hmm.
Apple can. And yet, in other ways, I have my headset. I keep glancing at it on my desk. And I don't use it that much because, uh,
Yeah.
for me as a dad, I have a dog. Like, even with the pass-through screen, putting on something on my face that's kind of heavy for long periods of time isn't always great. So my reaction is like, this is an amazing step. I'm so glad that Apple's investing all that they are, and yet this is definitely not the be all end all. And in fact, I don't know that most people will really need or want a Vision Pro as it looks today. So it's a mixed excitement.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I actually tried out the Apple Vision Pro at the Apple Store. And the price point was one of the jarring issues for me, but also like the second issue that I think I had with purchasing it or integrating it with my life was like, I just can't see myself like on the subway with a Vision Pro. Like, as immersive as the ecosystem is and how incredible it is to see like your text messages over here and like your work emails and then like your TV show over there, it's just like it's overwhelming and it's almost like as if like it's just not integrated yet.
Yeah,
Um,
and I
yeah.
think it'll take adjustment for people to become more comfortable with it. There's an interesting history that I don't know if your listeners are familiar
Mhm.
with, of when the earpods came out with like the Sony Walkman,
Uh-huh.
and when they came out, there were press articles, you can look them up, talking about how rude it was for people to wear headphones in public. And you can
Oh yeah.
imagine if, like, no, for the first time ever, someone's getting on a public bus and like shutting out the world by putting on headphones, that could be pretty jarring. And
Mhm.
so now, people put in headphones anywhere and you just take it for
Yeah.
granted, accept it. I don't know that that will happen with like a full-on giant headset. Like that feels like a bigger adjustment. But I do think that there's a factor that's just like norms and time that will make all of this make more sense to everybody.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I didn't know that. That's so cool that that's kind of like the reaction to headphones. Now I feel like people say it's almost psychotic to not wear headphones.
Right.
When you're commuting or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, I almost wonder if like I don't know like if only I was following this when this happened a couple years ago, but like when Snapchat released their Snap glasses, um like I almost think they had the right idea, just weren't solving the right use cases like Apple is. And I almost wonder if like a Vision Pro Lite is the future, like
Yeah,
with sunglasses acting like um
probably.
yeah.
I agree with your assessment of the
Mhm.
Snapchat spectacles, and similarly the like Ray-Ban Meta partnership.
Yeah.
They just look like sunglasses, and so the
Yeah.
beauty of those is you can wear them around and not get unwanted attention and still get some value. But to your point, they're a lot more limited because mostly because of like the laws of physics. It's hard to do what
Right.
Apple Vision Pro does
Of
on
course.
a device that has a tiny battery and doesn't have like a full-on screen. I was a beta tester for Google Glass, which was like the predecessor
Right.
to the spectacles, and I remember I was living in New York City at the time, and I was like, I'm gonna wear it on my way to work because like I'll try it out, whatever.
Mhm.
And I got so many stares, some people yelling at me. Like it was
Right.
unpleasant, and that has to be considered as like a as and by the way, that like the what you could actually see was just like a kind of a dim
Mhm.
overlay in the corner of your eye. So so yeah, it's super exciting. I think that it does similarly to you know, world becoming digital world becoming more 3D. It seems inevitable that people will have smarter glasses over time. At the
Yeah.
same time, I think sometimes, myself included, people overhype the potential of that market. And I think about it as like, it's probably comparable to like the smartwatch market, not
Mhm.
like the iPhone or maybe like the iPad, like the tablet market. And like tablets are a great example of something that are incredible. It's a superior experience in so many ways to a phone. And yet when I'm at home, I usually just use my phone. And so like you
Yeah.
have to be not just better, you have to be enough better than the alternatives.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And so I'm curious, like with rooms, what is kind of like the market that you're trying to target? What's the problem you're trying to solve? Like the value proposition, all of it.
Well, so I think when I say that our digital futures are going to become more 3D, I think that's
Hmm.
already happened to some extent and doesn't even require a special headset or a special display.
Yeah.
So I have my oldest son is 8, and he introduced me to Minecraft a couple of years ago, uh, and that is an entirely 3D world, right? And
Mhm.
it's a world that hundreds of millions of people, many kids, have learned how to navigate fluently, and and similarly, you know, Roblox is used by probably on the order of hundreds of millions of users. So, um, so whether or not headsets become the norm, or holographic displays, or something else that we haven't even thought of, I think that like that 3D nature will continue to grow, and will you know, move away from um, yeah, you know, Flappy Bird type 2D experiences, increase
Probably.
to Minecraft type experiences.
That's so interesting, and I definitely find that to be true. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I work in digital strategy at Adobe, and one of the biggest use cases that we see that is important when we're working with retail customers is the ability to like try on or test out products
Mm.
via the website or via the app. And that's just such a huge space when it comes like speaking as a consumer and then also speaking as like a pre-sales technical product specialist. Like it's we see like that appeal and that's a huge use case and a huge seller. as well. So I think that's it's really cool, like gaming and like,
Well,
consumerism melding like that.
yeah, and I think in our current like day and age where so many people get so much of their stuff from the internet,
Right.
it's one would expect that like they could have a better and better representation of what they're going to get in advance. I recently ordered some magnetic toy blocks on the internet that looked amazing and turned
Hmm.
out to be like a tenth of the size I thought they were. Right, like that could
Right.
be solved if there was like a natural, easy AR preview of it in my space. If that was seamless enough that I would have used it.
Yeah, I mean, I bought my bed literally by like scanning my room and like imagining a bed in that space. It was the coolest thing in the world.
Which
Um,
is how that people should purchase beds. You
yeah.
mentioned we're back in Allentown, Pennsylvania. We lived in California for a time in New York, and we built a house here. And when we were building it, it was very important to me to have a 3D rendering of it before it was built.
Oh
And
yeah.
luckily, we were able to do that with someone I found on Fiverr from Turkey who was super talented. But
That's
it kind of
awesome.
boggles my mind that the vast majority of houses, buildings are built without anyone having like an exact idea of what it's going to look like. There's
Yeah.
usually like some sketches of what like it looks like from certain perspectives. And inevitably, as you begin building, you realize some things don't work, and some of those things you can actually anticipate with like a virtual reality tour and 3D model.
Yeah.
Certainly, we saw some of that stuff. So I think like all of this is just going to become increasingly expected and norm.
No, totally. That totally makes sense. And so I want to shift a little bit more to like your career journey. So I noticed, what was your background? What did you study in college, and like how did you kind of end up in like the product space based off of that? Like, are you a programmer? Are you a leader? Like an entrepreneur? Like, how do you
Yep.
define yourself?
Um, so I would define myself as an entrepreneur.
Hmm.
Ever since I was a small child, I was fascinated by like how businesses work, and
Right.
I was selling candy on the school bus, less because of like the money I was making, because it was like, quarters, but more because I just found it like, I find the concept of like creating a system, almost like a virtual machine that like exchanges, you know, money or the equivalent for services or good. I just find that like to be fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like a Rube Goldberg machine to me. And so I've always felt that way. As I was growing up, I the internet was also growing up, and I found that I could actually practice being an entrepreneur on the internet, and nobody needed to know I was 14 years old. And so I did a lot of that, a lot of business on eBay, um, and a few other things in high school and in college. Um, given your audience, I should mention that when I was deciding what to do after high school, I knew I was like into business and computers. And I ultimately decided to pursue business. I studied business undergrad, um, primarily because I felt like I was better at it. And in hindsight, I think I should have studied computer science. I wish I, it's not that I should have, but I wish I did. Because and I think that's a challenge that young people face, may face generally, talented young people, where it's like, do you do what you're good at, or do you do what you're most passionate about? And over time in my career, I've increasingly done more um, technical work. Um, but yeah, so it's a I did teach myself to code in high school and in college, but never beyond like some basic CS classes in college. Never got like the full on CS education.
Gotcha. I mean, I feel like as so many people face that choice, right? Computer science versus business. I think a lot of people who listen to our podcast probably face that choice. So it's interesting to hear. And so I'm curious, kind of like, how did you find, I believe product marketing was your first role. Like, how did you find product marketing? How did you shift to product management? Like, what did that thought process and journey look like for you?
Sure. So when I was in college, I graduated in 2008, and so
Tough year to
2007.
graduate. Yeah,
Sorry.
tough year to graduate.
Yeah, it wasn't the best
Yeah,
financial market, but we did all of our like interviewing the year before, which when it was not as
hmm
bad, 2007,
good.
and most people who I went to school with that were studying business were pursuing consulting or investment banking,
Right.
which I didn't really understand what those were until probably like my junior year of college, anyways, and maybe not even then. So I sort of said, okay, well, I don't love the idea of investment banking, so let me pursue consulting. But Google happened to be interviewing on my campus for like three random jobs, and on a whim, I was like, I'll apply to all those jobs. One of the jobs was literally like a caretaker, like nanny at the on-site like Google Plex on-site childcare center. I think I didn't apply to that one because I didn't think I'd be very good at it. But the other two I applied to without understanding even like the meaning of the roles because Google felt fascinating. And but then I got an on-site interview and visited the Google Plex in Mountain View and was completely blown away, especially contrasting it to the visits with consulting companies I'd gone to. There was a feeling of excitement, of invention, and like also of like fun and silliness at Google at the time that I couldn't resist. And so I ended up joining Google in a position called Associate Product Marketing Manager, which again, like didn't know what that meant, didn't fancy myself very good at marketing, didn't love marketing, but ended up in this role that in hindsight was like there couldn't have been a better starting point. And perhaps if you have listeners who did decide to take the business path or do decide it, product marketing roles are actually like a really nice starting point. And the reason for that is because I sat next to a product manager who I could learn from. So the way I sort of explained the division of like of responsibilities was the product manager's job was to optimize the product to make the best possible product. My first product I worked on was Chrome. So there were multiple PMs that were like, we need to make Chrome the best. And my job was to get the most number of people using it given the existing product, which is a fun job. And it turns out learning how to get people to use it helps you become a better product manager too. So not only was I able to observe other people and learn from them, but I was also able to understand what motivates people to download something in the first place and what doesn't. And that has implications on product development.
That's so interesting. I think that's so cool. That you ended up like things just worked out, right? You ended up in the place that was right for you. And I think it's important, to count your blessings even when they seem to be coming from really weird places. And
Totally. And
um,
also
yeah,
say that like it was not at all an obvious decision for me to go to Google at that time. Um, in 2007, Google was like the top search engine, but it didn't have Gmail or Maps or Android or all these other
right.
things. And all of my peers are going into consulting and investment banking. So it felt like it was a very difficult decision at that time. Ultimately, there was a guy who gave me uh, some advice that maybe applies to some of your listeners or will in the future. And he said, look, and my concern, by the way, at the time was like, oh, Google's peaked. They're already number one in search. Like, what else are they
Mhm.
going to do? Actually, they had Gmail as well. Um, uh, and I'd rather, I don't know, do a startup after consulting. And he said, whatever happens, like Google's at the center of Silicon Valley at this time where like the internet is exploding, and it'll be an interesting journey no matter what, even if it like implodes. Um,
Right.
and he was right. And I think you could probably point to certain places today, like OpenAI, where even if OpenAI isn't like the most successful company in 20
Yeah.
years, like that's the center of generative AI right now. And so there's
Yeah.
something to be said about like surrounding yourself with people at that center if you can.
No, totally. And speaking of imploding, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your time at Vine.
Yeah.
I know you left a year before it was shut down. I'm curious, like, did you see it coming? What was your experience like at Vine? Like, and then what were the differences also between like working, in Twitter and Vine, versus Google?
Yeah. So I did not see it coming, first of all. But so I left before I joined Vine. I was working at YouTube and leading mobile creation, which was not a priority at the time. It was before
Right.
Snapchat had become big. And in part, it wasn't a priority because internet speeds and phones speeds were just not so good that you could upload long videos from your phone. At the time that I joined YouTube, and for years after, you actually the only way to upload a video to YouTube from your phone was via like the Apple Photo Gallery via this like super janky interface that like no one would ever be able to. It took like 22 taps, I think I counted. So I was working on how do we make this easier, and we built this standalone app called YouTube Capture that opened right on the camera screen, and it had elements that I think we've seen later, but and it had hundreds of thousands of users, but on Google scale, it was like a rounding error. Um, Vine comes along and takes a different approach, whereas the app we were building was like allowed you to upload any length content. There weren't many constraints. Vine has this super opinionated 6.5 second square looping constraint, and people loved it. And so I joined after it had become like the number one downloaded app on the App Store at the time. And what I learned on my first day, which perhaps I should have learned when I was interviewing, and maybe this will also be a lesson for your listeners, was that Vine usage was never higher than it was the day before Instagram launched video.
Oh,
And
wow.
not super shocking, right? Like people anticipated that Instagram video would deal a blow to Vine. But I think the bigger problem it has, I mean, we still had tens of millions of mobile users, hundreds of millions of people looking at Vines on the web. So it was still a very substantial app, but there was this like comparison point that had been set, and actually Twitter suffered from the same thing, in my opinion. They While I was there, it felt like not felt like there were statements about we can be as big as Facebook, and Twitter at the time had like 300 million users, which is like a lot of users, but Facebook had like 1.3 billion, right? Like it was, and so when you create that comparison, I'm a big believer that everything is relative. It just puts everything in like a framing that doesn't seem as great. So I'd also say like comparing Google to Vine. Google, we had like every single piece of data logged, anonymized for PII and all that. But like there was data, there was organization, there were systems. When I joined Vine, there were like 15 people, and I was like, "Where's like the meeting notes doc?" And they're like, "What meeting notes doc?" And I'm like, "Where's like the current mocks?" And they're like, "What are you talking about?" So it was much more scrappy and startupy, which has certain advantages, but also certain disadvantages. We One thing that we didn't talk as publicly about with Vine was that our usage was extremely seasonal, and so in the absence of having analytics in place, it sometimes felt like, oh my God, Vine is like growing like crazy. This is amazing. And then like months later, oh my God, nobody's using Vine anymore. What's happening? And only after we started measuring the data and had like a year's worth of data did we realize that usage would peak during the school year, and then in the summer would drop off tremendously. Maybe because people using Vine were going outside. I don't know. Uh, and then we could anticipate it at least. We could be like, oh, okay, come September, we're going to see a huge spike in usage, and we can compare it to like last year's spike. Um, Anyways, I think to your question, what ultimately happened to Vine, My understanding from friends who continue to work there, and from my own experience with Twitter, was that Twitter was in a difficult spot as a company. They were going through like a rotating cast of heads of product, um, and they were unable to sustain the growth that they hoped. And having just become a public company, that became a problem. And so my understanding is that when Jack returned, which was shortly before I left, he wanted to focus the company. And so one way to focus it is to say, okay, what are things outside of core Twitter, like Vine, like another product called Crashlytics, and they ultimately sold Crashlytics to Google, and were unsuccessful at finding a buyer for Vine. I don't know any of the details of of that attempt, but I know it was in consideration, and I think it was one of the biggest mistakes that major tech companies ever made.
Hmm.
I think that's easy to. That's not even like a stretch to say in light of the success of TikTok.
Right.
Vine wasn't the first short form video app. There were many apps before it that led the way, um, and uh, and yet, given the magnitude of TikTok's success, it's crazy to think that Twitter just shut that down.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And so interesting to hear your insights. Especially to think about it and reflect on it, now seeing TikTok, it's so interesting. And so, to wrap up our conversation, I'd love to ask, what finally made you shift from big tech, to entrepreneurship? And like, what are some lessons learned from that experience?
Yeah. So one of my advisors had given me some advice early on that was well intended, but I think was in hindsight not the best advice. And that
Hmm.
advice was, Jason, I know you want to start a company someday. Why don't you do it on the side while you work at Google and or
Right.
wherever? And then once you've validated it, then uh, you could leave and do it. And I tried like starting some things on the side, but at least for me, I found that I couldn't give it my all. I couldn't help
Yeah.
but give my all to my full time job, and for good reason. I was enjoying my full time job. Like it was, this is not like a sob story or something, but I just like wasn't able to commit the attention um to something outside of my core work, and so I made a promise to myself, on the recommendation of a peer, that like by the time I'm 40, I'm not going to be working for the man. I think I said by the time I'm 35. And so basically, once like I hit 35, uh, I was like, all right, when am I going to start this company? And ultimately
Hmm.
took one last job at Meta, with like clear expression of to them that it was going to be a finite period of time, and then just said I'm got to bite the bullet and like give myself the space to explore and try this. And hindsight's always 2020. It was I was very extremely lucky to have those thoughts at a time when venture capital um, funding was relatively uh, highly available. The market to start a company when we started it in 2021 was much easier because there was no, the alternative was to put your money in a bank with 0.1% interest rate. So people wanted to invest, and VC firms benefited from that, and companies benefited from that. Obviously, things have corrected since, but so I think just like a ton of factors, and the last factor that went into it was with COVID and everyone working remotely. It felt like, and I had already moved to Pennsylvania at that time. It felt like I could actually start this company from this town in Pennsylvania where there's
Right.
a total of four software engineers probably, and I could work with people across the world, and that's not just like theoretical, but that's actually like a thing that can happen today. And so that's what I did. And to this day, our team now is based in France and Pennsylvania and California. And it's not always super convenient because of time zones, but otherwise it works.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking us through this story. And hearing all of your insights was so informative for me. I can't imagine it won't be informative to the listeners. So really appreciate you taking the time. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on a new episode. And we'll catch you in a couple of weeks.